They don't want the property, it's hassle, it's actually seen like a real problem to them, then turned into a single let, and it was okay, it wasn't making lots of money. How can we use this property in a better way than the existing owner? They might have a lot more property than you. That doesn't mean they know more than you. You might think, why on earth did the owner not do that? It's because they've been using the property in a certain way and they're kind of blinkered to the opportunities. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Property Magic Podcast, in which I'm going to be talking about property gold. Now, actually, gold is a very relevant topic right now because we've seen gold values have gone up pretty much 50% over the last 12 months. So should everyone be jumping into gold? Well, often when things are at the top might not be a good time to jump in, and maybe it's going to go much further, who knows? One of the big problems with gold is that you can hold it, but it doesn't actually give you any income. That's the thing I love about property. Not only does property give you income, it also goes up in value over the long term, and you can actually borrow other people's money to buy property as well. But actually, I think you can actually take lead and turn it into gold within the property arena. Let me explain what I mean by that. You see, very often we see someone who's selling a property because they don't want the property, it's hassle, it's actually seen like a real problem to them. And it's a bit like a lead weight around their neck, weighing them down. And we can potentially take that lead weight off their neck. And as we take it off, because we use it in a different way, we're a bit more creative maybe, we can turn that lead into gold. I know there's a bit of a pun here, but I think you can genuinely do this, because very often when we buy a property from maybe a retiring landlord who maybe owned that property for the last 20 years, they've had some great capital growth over that time. But you know what? They probably are not maximizing that problem, not making the most out of it. Probably the rents are not as high as they could be because most landlords don't put the rents up every year. Last couple of years we've seen rents generally go up about 30%, but most people don't do that because if you've got a good tenant in the property, you're inclined to keep that tenant there, because if you put the rents up too much and they move off, you might have some void periods, you might need to do some work to the property, and if someone has had a property for a while, they probably haven't kept it up to the level that it should be. You can use a little bit of a bit of love and care and a bit of a redecoration. So if you take a property on from a landlord that they're struggling with, and we know how to correctly manage that and create the most income from it, we could take what is someone else's lead weight and literally turn it into gold. Whether we're buying that property or we might just be controlling it through a purchase lease option, doesn't matter. We can see it in a different way. And I think very often landlords have been using a property in a certain way and they get a bit focused and almost a bit blinkered to other uses for that property. For example, right now, all around the country, as I record this, there are student landlords who have some empty properties because there's an oversupply of student HMOs in most areas, partly because of the new purpose-built buildings that are popping up everywhere. And so a student landlord who's been renting to students for a decade and doing it very successfully, and suddenly this year they've not been able to rent it. Maybe it's a bit too far from the university, maybe it's not quite up to scratch as good as some of the other student accommodation, so they've not had any tenants. And they might be sitting there scratching their head wondering, oh my God, what am I going to do? My property's empty, I can't find students. Now, you wouldn't want to take that on and also try and rent to students because you have exactly the same problem. But if we think slightly differently, we can say, well, instead of students, maybe we can put young professionals into that property. Because often when people graduate from university, they get a job. Sometimes they stay in the same university city and actually they live in the same area because they know the area, they've got friends there, they know the local pubs and restaurants, and actually that can work really well. So the student landlord who's very focused on just renting to students, maybe they're not even aware that you could rent to other groups of people, such as young professionals or working people, or even you could give it to a charity who might house vulnerable people there. So you've got to recognize that when you're speaking to a landlord, many of my clients get a bit nervous. Oh my God, they've been investing 20 years. What am I going to say to them? Well, actually, as long as you know a little bit, you can talk to them, hold your weight. They're probably not going to ask you how many properties you've got. And the reason is that landlord really wants to know how you can solve their problem for them. So when you speak to a seller, you want to understand what's going on for them, what's the situation. If we think a bit more creatively, then we might be able to say turn that lead weight that they've got around their neck, take it off them and turn it into gold, a far more profitable opportunity for us. And I remember when I was living in my second home in Selly Park in Birmingham, I'd moved out of my first one in 1998. I turned it into a student property and I lived with some friends in this second property. Then I eventually moved on and got an apartment. My third property was with my girlfriend at that time. We put it into her name, so we were able to use her first time buyer mortgage, and the second house I rented out. And for a number of years, I used it as an HMO, but actually it's a little bit too far from the university. I then turned it into a single let, and it was okay. It wasn't making lots of money, and eventually I decided to sell that property and use the money in better cash flowing assets like HMOs. And that property, you know, there was potential for an extension and a conversion. I thought about it, but I never did it. And I literally drove past that the other day. Well, my wife drove past with me in the car. And I looked at that property and whoever owns it now has added value. And they've done something which I thought about but never got round to. So very often landlords have been using a property in a certain way, and that's how they see it. They can't see it differently. Whereas we can go with a fresh pair of eyes and we can see it in a different way that they can't see. And that's how we're turning that lead into gold. In the same way that we can take a property that maybe someone's using a single let and we can use it as serviced accommodation. And we can change the way we're renting it, in this case, very short term for a higher rent, and make a lot more money. Even though it's not full all the time, we can make a lot more than someone would as a single let. But because that's how they've been using it, that's their knowledge, that's their experience. So one of the points I'd like you to take away from this week's episode of the Property Magic podcast is whenever we're looking to acquire a property, particularly from an existing landlord, we need to think a little bit differently, outside the box maybe. How can we use this property in a better way than the existing owner? Maybe it's just improving the standards and raising the rents. Maybe it's using it for a different type of tenant. Maybe it's extending it or developing it in a way that they haven't thought about. And this is a great example of the freehold to leasehold title splitting strategy. I've done a previous episode all about title splitting. If you haven't listened, go and listen to that, where we can find a freehold building where a landlord has previously created individual apartments within that building because they know they can rent out the individual apartments and make a lot more rent than if they rented just the whole house. And maybe they haven't created the individual titles because they didn't need to do that in order to rent the property out. So why would you spend money with a solicitor that you didn't have to spend? And then we go along and recognizing they've not created the leases, we can then buy the property, create the individual leases and increase the value just by doing that legal paperwork. Often no physical work at all. You might think, why on earth did the owner not do that? It's because they've been using the property in a certain way and they're kind of blinkered to the opportunities. So the huge opportunity for you is when we're looking for particularly retiring landlords. And right now we have more landlords than ever before leaving the property market for various reasons. They're just fed up. They don't want to be a landlord anymore. They want to capitalize on the huge capital growth they've had for many years. We can take what they were doing with the property, we can use it in a different way and we can turn it from that lead into gold. Remember, when you're speaking to a landlord, often my clients say, I'm a bit nervous, someone who's been investing for 20 years. They might have been investing for 20 years, but they might have just had one strategy and one way of using that property. They might have a lot more property than you. That doesn't mean they know more than you. Because most landlords, they don't go to network meetings, they don't watch YouTube videos, they don't go and do property training courses. They've just got a certain amount of knowledge and experience, which has worked for them very well up until this point. But now they've decided, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to retire, I'll write about the renters' rights bill, all these things coming up. They're now exiting the market and we can acquire these properties, use them in a much better and more profitable way. So until next time, I hope you've enjoyed watching the Property Magic podcast. Make sure you like this video, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit the bell icon to make sure you're notified anytime a new video comes out. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I encourage you, invest with knowledge, invest with skill.